Hello and welcome to today's really intriguing Goldster Inside Story. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next hour, where we're going to be talking about statues. Yes, remember the pulling down of the one of Edward Colston in Bristol? Worry not, it happens all the time, all over the world, and it's been going on for centuries. Why? Our attempts to punish history? Is it? The answer lies with my guest, who is not a sculptor, nor is he an engineer. He's a philosopher and a psychologist with an expertise of how individuals succumb to the madness of crowds. Do we find it easier to hate than to love? And when societies fracture into warring tribes, we felt a bit of that with Brexit, didn't we? We demonize those who oppose us, and we tear down the statues, forgetting that what begins with that sort of destruction often leads to the killing of people. And we also forget that history actually, in truth, cannot be rewritten. The man who can guide us through the madness in our minds, Dr. Peter Hughes. Welcome to Goldster Inside Story.
Thank you very much, Humphrey. Very pleased to be here.
That's great. Now, talking about rewriting history, Goldster has got a new alliance, brand new alliance with Aspects of History. That's its website, Aspects of History, a newsletter, book reviews, podcasts, blogs available to Goldster members for a 50% discount. And Peter, I met you at a party there, didn't I? Tell us just two nuggets about Aspects of History.
Yes, well, it's a great organization, and as a philosopher and a psychologist, as well as somebody with a passion for history, it's lovely to deal with an organization whose reason to exist is to promote great historical writing. And some of the best historians in the world are available on the Aspects of History website, and you can buy their books there, and they promote their work there. They promote their ideas. It's absolutely fabulous site.
That's great. I've just put all that in the chat. If you can see how to get hold of Peter and how to get hold of Aspects of History there in the chat. And the next thing I'm going to put down there, as you answer my first question, is all the statues that you've written about in this book here, The History of Love and Hate in 21 statues. And we're going to have one of Goldster's occasional competitions. And as I put this list up here now, I am going to ask you, which one, have I got all 21? Which one has been pulled down twice over a course of many, many years? And the first one that answers that, then we will move on and explain. Peter will tell us the whole story about it. Which one of those 21 has been pulled down twice over many, many years? And also, we won't be able to cover all these statues. So if one of those catches your fancy, your curiosity, just put it in there and we'll break off whatever we're doing and deal with that story. Now, first, Peter, I have a rule of no assumed knowledge on our Goldster shows. Many of us think we know what a statue is, but tell us, what exactly is a statue?
Well, it depends from where you look at it from, but in broad terms, why do people put statues up? Why are our towns, our cities, our landscapes peopled with these historical figures from the past? Why do they stand there? Well, there are many different reasons for that. I mean, firstly, they are there as symbols of identity and power. It says, this is who we are. This is the tribe. This is the culture to whom we belong. They're also there as symbols of competence, people who've achieved great things. They're there to commemorate great events, battles, great innovations, great cultural moments of cultural progress, and so statues can be put up for a wide variety of reasons, and the reason they're put up, of course, is the same reason that they're taken down. If they're put up to affirm one identity, they're taken down to affirm another, and what they bear witness to at one level is not just a history of a particular culture or a particular society, but it's also symbols of the values, the morals, the ethics, the values that we stand for, or indeed that we once stood for. And there's been sorry.
No. So I was just thinking, in London, where I live, and I cycle around there a lot, yeah. I see all these statues, and it's always sort of middle-aged men in uniform sitting on horses, yeah, doing things, you know. This is our colonial past, isn't it? But this is not what we are at the moment.
No, it's not who we are at the moment. And I think if you look at the great era really of statue construction in the UK. It's from the mid to late 19th century up until the First World War. I mean, that's when the mass of statues came up, and they were often celebrating great figures, or allegedly great figures from the history of colonialism. And hence there's why the debate is so ferocious around many of these statues, and why people say they don't represent us, because who we are as a culture, who we are as a society, who we are as a people changes over time. So the argument is that these statues, therefore, no longer represent us, therefore they should come down. But of course, the logic there being any statues we now put up, they won't represent us in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time. Yeah. Whoever we are by then, they too should come down, which led the Guardian journalist Gary Young to make a rather provocative observation. He said, take them all down, all of them. Edward Colston, Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, get them all down. So let's have a world without any statues at all. But of course, human psychology doesn't lend itself to that kind of return to year zero. Human psychology demands that we have some allegiance to something or someone that we believe in. And hence why the debate over statues can become quite ferocious. No more so, of course, than the statue of Edward Colston, which was torn down in the wake of the murder of George Floyd.
Yes, that's what I wanted to start with Edward Colston, because it's sort of, the George Floyd murder happened over in the United States. Suddenly there's a Black Lives Matter movement that crosses over to us. And then out of the blue, almost, where somebody is pulling down this statue. Tell us who Edward Colston was and how that statue was pulled down.
Okay, Edward Colston was a slave trader. He made his fortune by being on the board of the Royal African Company. He was responsible really for as many as 80,000 deaths during the transfer of slaves on the Middle Passage in the late 18th, early 18th century. So he was, but his statue, although he was deputy governor of the Royal African Company in 1689, his statue wasn't put up until much later. And the debate over Colston really was so ferocious because he also invested the money. He used the money that he made out of human misery and slavery. He invested much of it in philanthropy. So in Bristol, he formed charitable institutions, hospitals, schools. There was even a bun named the Colston Bun. So here we have human nature really in all its glorious or murky ambiguity. Here we have somebody who made his money and made his fortune out of trading in human life.
But it was legal, wasn't it, at the time?
But it was legal then.
He was not breaking the law.
Yeah, he was not breaking the law. So one of the theories, there's a bit of a side point here. One of the theories at this point is that, well, he was a man of his time. So should we condemn him for being a man of his time? Well, there were men of that time who were ardent abolitionists. Abolitionism wasn't, unknown at that time. There was plenty of a movement towards abolitionism. And certainly it evolved obviously over the coming century, but abolitionists were not unheard of. But of course he was a man of his time. But the ambiguity is, how can you on the one hand trade in cruelty and death, and on the other invest the proceeds of that in life and in the enhancement of the society of which you're a part? And the answer to that is actually quite simple when it comes to human society, which is, who is the tribe to which I belong? Who are my people? And what are the values that I adhere to? So he would unquestionably have had what by today's standards, although at that time they were quite common, but by today's standards would be incredibly abhorrent views about racial hierarchies and the competence of whites compared to Black people. And he would have lived in a world where racial hierarchies were not only accepted, but they were normative.
But other comparisons here, because we've been reading about the Russian oligarchs who made their money out of questionable deals when Russia was collapsing and when communism was collapsing. And 10 years ago, they were welcomed in, owning football clubs and mansions, all the rest of it, and hobnobbing with politicians. That was their time and their tribe. And suddenly they're all banned and being sanctioned, aren't they?
Yeah.
So is this? I mean, I know it's it might be a cheap shot, but is this the sort of Edward Colston shift that you get? It's okay now, but it's not okay now.
Of course, And that's human nature. And there's a wonderful book called Hierarchy in the Forest by Christopher Baum. He's an anthropologist, and he did a lot of work with nomadic peoples, with human foragers, as well as looking obviously at our nearest evolutionary ancestors, the other great apes. And because as one evolutionary psychologist pointed out rather wonderfully, he says, we're not fallen angels, he said, we're risen apes. And that's what we are. We're one of the 5 great apes. And what Christopher Baum pointed out, he said there were some human universals. Ethnocentrism is universal. Blood revenge is universal. War is universal. Raiding is universal. War is universal.
And statues are universal.
And statues are universal. Icons, statues, having something that we need to say this embodies our values. And
how much of this is... And how much of this, I mean, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not bow down to any graven image. That's the statue thought, is it?
It is, but we do bow down to graven images, not just material icons, but ideologies. I find it extraordinary that there are people today who, and tragic, inevitably there will be, who will still consider like a Stalinist ideology or of any social utility at all, or a fascist ideology. So how do these people, fascism and communism between them have been responsible for the murder and brutalizing of countless tens of millions of people.
And statues everywhere.
And statues everywhere. And statues everywhere, sure. Absolutely statues everywhere. I was in Moscow 3-4 years ago, and there was in Red Square a good old statue of Karl Marx. But of course, these are ambiguous. No thinker is entirely wrong. No thinker is entirely right. You can read Marx and you will pull some wonderful insights from Marx. You can read the Marquis de Sade. You can pull some wonderful insights from the Marquis de Sade. It doesn't matter how much we want to universally condemn one particular perspective or one particular thinker or this particular ideology. There's a phrase I use, a quote by one of Martin Luther King's essays, and he said, look, he said, there's some of the best in the worst of us and some of the worst in the best of us. And when we see that, we actually become more humane. We learn to turn the light on ourselves before we point our finger at others. Because
there's that the phrase that the communist Chinese use, that Mao was 70% good and 30% bad, and that's one of those mixes. We have a question from Emma here that takes us on from Goldster to Cecil Rhodes. She says she's interested in the Cecil Rhodes statue. So tell us, do you have it in your book? Did you have that page
Cecil Rhodes,
in the book you can show us, Peter? Yeah. Oh, this is the paperback that's coming out in April the 5th, isn't it? If you could show us the cover there. Look for that in the bookshops, because it's not the same as the hardback that I have.
And that's the beheaded statue of Cecil Rhodes in Cape Town. Now, Rhodes was a racist, okay? He was a white supremacist, right? But what's interesting about Rhodes is the Rhodes Must Fall movement, really, which actually spread through to, obviously, Oxford University, and the statue of Cecil Rhodes above Oriel College and Oxford University, because he was a white supremacist, and he had this vision of an Anglo-Saxon elite, running, an entirety of Africa from the south right through to Cairo in the north, which is why his statue is facing Cairo, and he wanted to create this Anglo-Saxon elite. So in his will he left a large sum of money to have some of the best of people to be educated at Oxford University, so they could propagate his ideology and pass it on through the generations, and in his view, make the world a much more culturally sophisticated and better place. But of course, Rhodes was a racist. He was, what he did in Africa was reprehensible. But when it comes to his statue, what's interesting is Dr. Marie Cowther Dauda, who's the only African tutor in Oriel College, described the protests against Rhodes as a dazzling sign of white supremacy. She mocked the protesters, saying they can't look at the statue they can't even look at a statue without throwing a tantrum. She called them the woke Taliban. And that's interesting, coming from Oriel College, where Rhodes' statue stands, the only African tutor at Oriel College.
Give us a little bit more psychological depth in that. What is going through the minds of these people with all this bandwidth that we've got to concentrate their loathing and hatred on something that happened so long ago and that statue? What is it they want to achieve?
I don't think it's the loathing and hatred. There's many. This is a really complex. Psychologically, this is a complex issue. So
well, you do say love and hate, so you have to go into it for us.
You have to go into it. This is the complex. This is the complexity of it, because when you look at somebody like Rhodes, of course you can condemn Rhodes for his actions during his life. You can condemn Rhodes for his racism, but why do we protest the statue now? He's long dead. He's gone. He's finished. Well, because we protest the values, particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. The link is made between the values that Cecil Rhodes has and the values of modern day racist white supremacists who perpetuate in their behavior, whether they're conscious of it or not, that particular kind of ideology. That's what the protesters will say. It's not that it's locked in the past, but we're fighting those type of ideas as they exist in the present, not as they existed then, because of course he's long dead.
Can I bring something in? Because we had on our sister show, Purpose, Passion and Grit, a month or so ago, a human rights lawyer called Terry Collingsworth, and he has done much work on West Africa trying to combat child slavery in the cocoa trade. Now, when I went during the Colston thing, I had a few interchanges with those people that you mentioned. They are not interested in current slavery, only in writing the historical slavery. Can you give me the psychology of that?
Yeah, it's a psychology of in-groups and out-groups, and this is a psychology of empathy. Extreme empathy is always linked to cruelty, and this is basically how it works. There was a police killing. I'm not sure exactly in which state it was recently. The police walk of a black American, and the police walked into an apartment. They weren't actually after this particular person, they were after someone else, but this particular person was lying on the sofa. He had a gun. He lifted the gun. They shot him. And at the moment, it's obviously quite rightly, there's now been investigated, and the whole thing is being looked at. After that, there was a huge protest, and I was listening to one of the speakers, and it was really instructive what he said. He says, "I want you to love one another," he said. "I want you to love one another with all your heart, with all your passion, with as much love as you have to give." And he said, "I want you to hate. I want you to hate those who don't think the way you do. I want you to hate those who are not on our side. I want you to hate them as much as you love each other." Now, that's the link between empathy and cruelty. Once you identify with an in-group, psychologically, once you identify with an in-group, and the intensity of your identification with that in-group and the empathy you show with that in-group, it'll be mirrored by the cruelty and the contempt with which you show those who are part of your out-group, which is why, for instance, on all sorts of debates at the moment, particularly around gender or race, you can get tweets which will go, "Horrible person, you this, you that, how dare you do this, you're the world's most wicked person, #empathy." And people think, how are those two compatible? Well, of course they're compatible.
#empathy.
Because you, I hate because you don't think like we do. You're on the wrong side of history. But you, and it's because we love the people who are on the right side of history so much.
So anybody who's not in your group is an outsider. So in the case that I put, anybody that wants to pull down the Colston statue or any statue or those statues is in your group. But somebody that comes up and says, "Well, hey, what about the 2 million child slaves in West Africa now?" They're irrelevant because they're not of your group.
Well, it's a different narrative, isn't it? I mean, I think that if you want to say, if you want to have a narrative of original sin and good and evil, which of course is the narrative really that white supremacy historically was based on. It was based on, the cultural, psychological, moral, spiritual, sanctification of people with low melanin against those with high melanin. So white people against black people. So white people were seen as purveyors of virtue, black people were seen as childlike, incompetent, had to be led, and so on and so forth. And that devaluation, that simple split, the refusal to see that we actually share a common humanity, the refusal to see
that refusal, isn't it? Yeah.
That whatever the color of your skin is, there is nothing that I can do that a brown person, a black person, a man or a woman can't do. There is no intellectual gift that I have that anyone else doesn't have. And what's fascinating here, I want to go back to the Rhodes issue here, because Nelson Mandela put his name to a Rhodes Scholarship. So
Yes.
Nelson Mandela created 10 Mandela Rhodes scholarships. Why
Okay.
would Mandela ally his name, his identity,
Yeah.
alongside a white supremacist or racist like Cecil Rhodes?
Right.
Why?
Yes.
Well, what he said was, and this goes into the really interesting issue that happened when in post-apartheid South Africa, when we had to look at what do we do with the statues that were our apartheid statues? And I'll come to that point in a moment. But
Yeah.
the point I want to say here is Mandela said, we've got to close the circle of hate.
Yes.
There are some, I'm talking about statues, he said, there are some people who are villains to me that are heroes to other people.
Yes.
There are some people that are heroes to other people
Absolutely.
that are villains to me. So we have to find a way of coexisting. And the
Yeah.
way to do that is, first of all, to put the light on myself. What gives me as an individual? Who am I to judge? And you know, we all, every single human being in our society, any society, we want the same things. We want to be seen as good, competent people. We want dignity. We want a warm bed. We want, you know, we want food in our bellies.
And that is universal.
That is human universal.
Jackie wants us to move on to the Bamiyan statues in Afghanistan that were destroyed by the Taliban.
Yeah, the Bamiyan statues are absolutely fascinating because the Buddhas of Bamiyan, there was in 1886, the Illustrated London News did a thought experiment. They made us imagine there was a grand parade of all the statues that had ever been built, all the great statues, the biggest statues the world had ever seen. And he commented they would all be dwarfed, he said, by these two giants, the two great Bamiyan Buddhas that overlooked the Bamiyan Valley in Afghanistan. And what's fascinating about that really was the link between the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas and 9/11. And the link is a really close one, you know, because the Taliban at one point said they wanted to preserve the statues. Yeah. And because not just because of their cultural importance, but actually for them, because it could be a source of foreign exchange and tourism and so on and so forth. But eventually, possibly under the influence of bin Laden and Al Qaeda, they decided to blow them up, and they took recruits they forced Shia Muslims and other people who they had equal contempt for to go up great ladders and to dig holes in the Buddhas and to put explosives in, and eventually they blew them all up. And when they did, there was great festivity. Shots were fired in the air. 9 cows were slaughtered. But a few months later, that was in about March 2001. In September 2001, of course, we have 9/11. And bin Laden glorifies, he says, I think a quote was something like, it was a joy, he said, to see the bodies of the infidels float to the earth like dust.
Yes.
And which, of course, was the fate of the Buddhas. The Buddhas themselves were blown up, and they too were turned to dust. So the link between the destruction of statues and the killing of people in the case of the Bamiyan Buddhas is a really close one.
And what is the difference, or is there a difference in the mindset of the Taliban? It's a huge organization, you know, think what you want, that decided to do that, and the sort of activists that pulled down Colston or want Rhodes out?
Well, let's look at Colston again. There was a sociologist, Frank Furedi. He said, well, when I looked at the tearing down of the Colston statue, the dragging of the body and the casting of it into the harbor, he said, I might as well have been looking at the killing of a real person, because the impulses are the same, you know. And we're not saying that this is in no way, shape, or form to sit down and say that Colston was some paragon of virtue any more than any of us are. Yeah. But the question is, when you take these kind of actions, what are your true motives? And I want to give you another example. This wasn't a statue. This was a renaming of a college in Edinburgh University, a tower. It was known as the David Hume Tower. Mm-hmm. And there was a petition raised. We can't call it the David Hume Tower because although he was really at the forefront of the Scottish Enlightenment, he made a few racist comments in footnotes in a couple of places. So it was the name had to change. But what do we change it to? And the idea was, we'll change it to Julius Nyerere, who was the Maoist dictator of Tanzania. And of course, eventually, the petitioner discovered that he was actually homophobic. among other things. Won't go to anything else. So then he wasn't good enough either. So now I think it's called 40 George Street, presumably named after King George. So God knows quite how that works.
Right.
But what you have here is the complexity of when we make these kind of moral judgments, because who is good enough to stand? So if you look at the Colston statue, if it was up to me, I would have contextualized it. Saying what I would have done with Colston, I'd have contextualized that statue, and I'd have contextualized it in a couple of ways, really. There was a really interesting protest once made on the Colston statue because a slave ship, people mocked up a slave ship on one side of the statue. And they put on the slave ship, examples of modern slavery, like kitchen staff, nail bar, so on and so forth, sexual slavery. So if you were to reinterpret that, you would really interpret it in a very, you'd interpret the ambiguity of a man like Colston, which is the ambiguity of us all. So you might keep the slave ship there, but on the other side, you might do a little mock-up of a school or a mock-up of a hospital. You're looking at human nature in all its complexity of how somebody can engage in something, which at the time was not seen from his eyes and the people he would associate with in any way reprehensible. It was simply the natural order of things, and this is pre-Darwin. So this isn't a post-Darwinian idea. So this is so you just have human nature in all its complexity, and that goes, for instance, you can see that in actions like the robber barons. We're now talking about oligarchs, but people like Andrew Carnegie who would exploit his workers. And in some cases kill them. And then he would use all the profits from his business to build libraries, to build great charitable institutions.
This is the art of sort of patronage, corruption and patronage and getting people. Patrick, I've got your question, and we're not going to deal with it next. I want to deal with at the end. What policies do you recommend on statues? Don't mention it at the moment. Suri says, has this something to do with the psychology of manufacturing victims?
Yeah, this is really interesting. Now there was a really interesting study done in the Journal of Social Psychology in 2021, and they looked at the correlation between virtuous victimhood and dark triad personality traits. And this is looking at when the dark triad personality traits are Machiavellianism, which is being devious and being cunning and getting what you want at all costs. Psychopathy, which is indifference to the needs of others and the relentless pursuit of one's own needs. And narcissism, which of course is a very grandiose and sense of one's own self-importance. And they said, the more you identify, he said, with virtuous victimhood, the more likely you are to display those traits. And this is how it works, because if being a victim, if virtuous victimhood is seen as having a high social status, in other words, you gain status through doing this. We are status-bearing creatures. This is the point that we have to understand about ourselves. We are status-craving creatures. And there are two types of rewards that you can get by being a virtuous victim. One is you get material rewards. So if you're on the right side of history and you're playing the narrative of virtuous victimhood, then you may get educational opportunity, you may get all sorts of grants for research or whatever. Yeah. But the key thing is the symbolic rewards. The status it gives you to be able to stand up and say, we are good. We in our tribe are good. We are the virtuous ones. You over there are the evil ones. And that is corrosive. And of course, it happens on all sides. It doesn't just happen on the political left. It happens on the political right. People talk about cancel culture. People think it's a phenomenon of the left. 2/3 in the United States of cancellations are to do with the left, but 1/3 of them come from the right. So you have the same censoriousness on both sides of the political debate. And there's a point here about basic psychology. There's never been a war fought from the perspective of those who fight it that wasn't a war of self-defense.
Yes. Yes. Suri's just come in. Can you please give the reference that you just mentioned, Peter, in beginning to answer her question?
I think the article was called something. It's in a Journal of Social Psychology, I think in 2020. I think it's called Virtuous Victimhood and Dark Triad Personality Traits. It's
that's right.
Like, but if you put dark triad personality traits into Google and Journal of Social Psychology, it's really quite a fascinating study.
Okay. I want to bring our audience back to the competition that we've got here. Right. I'm going to post down we're not going to talk about it yet because we're going to see if somebody can guess it. Which of the statues, 21 statues, has been pulled down twice over a gap of many, many years? You will get a round of applause from all the Goldster people if you get it right, and we will deal with it at the end of this end of this question. I don't think Thatcher is in your statues. Is it? Claire says the Thatcher statue was not popular.
Again, the Thatcher statue was not popular with some groups. It was popular with others.
Yeah.
This is the point. The Churchill statue, if you remember, in post George Floyd, we had the huge protests in London, and they had to board up the statue of Winston Churchill. Now, people say, well, Winston Churchill was a racist. Well, by today's standards, of course he was. He had views we would consider to be racist, but that's not all that he was.
Yes.
He was more than that. And he was a great wartime leader. He stood up against Nazi Germany.
But I also remember at that time, it was during lockdown in a way, wasn't it? I was cycling around London. Yeah. And I went to Trafalgar Square, where on either side of the Nelson's column, there's Lord Napier and Lord Havelock. Yeah. Now, between them, with the Opium Wars and the Indian Mutiny, which the Indians call the First War of Independence, they must have 3 or 4 million deaths on their hands, untouched, because nobody knew who they were. Yeah. These were guys on horses.
Right. Well, here's the thing. In the chapter on Goldster, I actually talk about Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the novella Heart of Darkness. And in the context of that, I actually look at some of the things that were happening around the time that book was written. Now, if you remember King Leopold of Belgium, he said he wanted a piece of what he called the magnifique gâteau africain, the magnificent African cake, and he wanted his slice of it, and he took it with extraordinary brutality. And among the things some of his colonial leaders really in Africa did was they would say to some of their men, you have to bring back to me hands or fingers that you've chopped off in a basket every day, so I can see how that you're exerting your power and that you're doing your job. So bring these, and sometimes he'd ask for penises to be brought in baskets, so that they could show that actually they've mutilated the bodies of men, not just the bodies of women and children. Yeah. And now, what's interesting, in the same chapter, I talk about a Tutsi warrior and Papi Kamanzi, and he says the revenge he took on the Hutus after Rwanda, he said he would kill with his bare hands. Maybe 100 people a day, many of the women and children, strangle them, butcher them with a machete, strangle them with barbed wire. And here we have the colonial brutality on the one hand, and here we have post-colonial brutality on another. And it just tells us something about our human nature. And it's only when we can affirm the dignity of each of us as individuals, regardless of our race, color, creed, class, that's actually when we can find a way to communicate and to validate each other. Because there's an American musician called Darrell Davis, who is famous for persuading members of the Ku Klux Klan to give him their robes. And he was born into a relatively affluent Black American family. His father was a diplomat or worked in the CIA, but he experienced racism as a young boy. Maybe he's 10, 11, 12 years old for the first time, and he was shocked by it. And he asked himself the question, he says, how can you hate me when you don't know who I am? How can you hate me when you don't know who I am? And he simply applied that logic. He applied that logic to people who are on the opposite side of the political and cultural divide. He applied it to white supremacists. How can I hate them when I don't know who they are? And the lengths he went to is extraordinary. He even lent members of the Ku Klux Klan his bus to take them to Ku Klux Klan marches. He did more than that in an extraordinary incident, because he knew all about the Klan and he befriended members of the Klan in an attempt to convert them and get them out of the Klan. One Klan member who wanted to move up the Klan hierarchy was doing an exam and he was lazy and he wasn't particularly bright. So he phoned up Darrell and said, Darrell, I've got this exam. I want to become higher up in the Klan, but I don't know the answers. Can you tell me what they're going to ask me and what the answers are? And Darrell said, yeah, sure, I'll tell you. And he told him, so you have a Black American telling a white racist how to progress within the Klan. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to change them, and he did. Yeah. Time and again, he succeeded because, and he now has a lockup full of Klan robes that they gave him.
It's sort of, in a way, what we're talking about here is what I call this birthright. We can't, it's no fault of ours how we're born. So whether you're Catholic or Protestant in Northern Ireland, whether you're Sunni or Shia in Iraq, or, so this is this sort of not liking somebody because of their birthright is not a great intellectual exercise, but it's very good for controlling a mob. isn't it?
It is, but I come here to the statue of Frederick Douglass, which is the last one I talk about in the book. He's a remarkable man. He was born in 1818, escaped from slavery in 1838, and he was famous really for a speech he gave called a black man is the 4th of July, and he said, look, America is full of racism. It's full of racists. It's full of racism. But the values that built America, he said, are only hope to get out of this. And there's two things he did in his life which were quite remarkable. He had a number of slave owners, and one of them, called Thomas Auld, he described as the worst of them all. When Auld was dead at this time, not only had Frederick Douglass freed himself from slavery, he was now a major figure in American culture. He was a great orator. He was a great abolitionist. He had really high status within the United States. And Thomas Auld said, "I want to see Frederick before I die." So Douglass said, "Yeah, okay." And people say this was some great act of love on the part of Douglass. Well, yeah, to some extent it was, but it was also a demonstration. Actually, times have moved on. He walked into the front door of Thomas Auld's house, not the back door. First black man to walk through the front door. And he spent some time with Thomas Auld. And he said, I abhor slavery, he said, and I abhor what you stood for, but it doesn't stop us communing as men. And another thing he wrote, if I could just make one further point on the passing on of guilt. Yeah. He said, I have no heart, and this is in one of his speeches, I have no heart, he said, to pass the sins of the fathers onto their children. Right. And that goes to the point. I have no heart to pass the sins
of the fathers onto the children. Exactly. That's. I want to move on to Iraq, actually, and the Saddam statue, because we were talking before about the sort of godlike thing. Yeah. And in Iraq during Saddam's time, we get this in North Korea, we've had it in China, and that is that you wake up in the morning and you look out of your house, and the chances are you're going to see his statue or a mural or whatever it is of your leader. And when the Americans went in 2003, they defaced all of that straight off, and we saw the statue being pulled down. What impact does that have on a society that's seen who controls them, whether they like it or not, all their lives, and suddenly no one controls them?
Yeah, that's really quite fascinating. I mean, this goes back to a point that Freud made, really, which is, he said, people, ultimately human beings, he says, they don't want freedom. It carries too much responsibility with it. They would rather, and actually this goes into what's happening in Ukraine and Russia at the moment. Putin's famous comment, he said, Russians don't want democracies, they want strong czars. Yeah. It's just, they just want to, and of course, what you're seeing in tyrannical regimes, like, and a statue I talk about there, for instance, in the book, I talk about Saddam Hussein. I talk about Confucius being torn down by Red Guards in 1966. I talk about the statue of Stalin in Budapest, in Hungary in 1956. And this is another function that statues perform. Statues can be there to intimidate, to dominate. Mm-hmm. To make the population feel that to remind them who it is that they have to pay fealty to, and lest they forget, they know the punishment that is coming their way. Yes. But of course, when you take a statue down, when you take an old regime down, the whole regime collapses, chaos ensues, and we saw it in Iraq. The idea. And for those of us, and I include myself in one of this, who opposed the Iraq War, you look at it at the time, you think, you really think you're going to take a complex situation that like you have in the Middle East and in Iraq, and you can just parachute in and rip all these structures apart, and suddenly, like as if you put water on a snowdrop, these wonderful plants will suddenly, these green shoots of democracy will emerge. It will be bloody and it will be chaotic. Yes. And this is where in the book, how the destruction of statues leads to the killing of people. Yes. I mean, Saddam Hussein is a classic example of that. The destruction of the statue of Confucius in 1966 is a classic example of that. It happened shortly after the first teacher had been clubbed to death and thrown in a garbage can in an elite school in Beijing.
This is the Cultural Revolution that Mao Zedong started.
The Cultural Revolution. The Red Guards marched into the Confucius ancestral home. They dug up graves. They hung long, rotting bodies from trees. They plundered graves of all the jewels. They dragged the statue of Confucius through the streets with a dunce's cap on his head. They cast it onto a fire. This is not just symbolic violence against a statue that mirrors the violence they want to commit against people. They were committing that violence against people. And they've all done it with the.
And now he's resurrected, isn't he? I don't know if there are any big statues or that statue's back.
It's not just that Maoism's been resurrected.
Yeah.
Illiberalism and this tyrannical way of thinking is being resurrected. In you have Erdogan in Turkey, you have the leader in Belarus, you've got Putin in Russia, you've got Xi Jinping in China. We have Maduro in Venezuela. We have and we have the illiberalism on the left and on the right, with identity politics on the left and white supremacy on the right, that is happening in our own societies that are going to tear us apart.
And the more extreme our societies become, the more statues are going to go up, because this is, I mean, Suri has said here that she's talking about idols. Bamiyan, she says, more of an idol, I think. Is this, these are sort of idol statue heroes that are going up, aren't they?
They represent value. So if you look what's happening now, that there's as the Confederate statues come down, then statues that reflect the more of the kind of anti-racist agenda in the United States, the moment will go up. But what we've got to do is we've got to listen to people like Mandela. We have to find some common ground here. Because otherwise, what happens is, and I've compared it before, it's almost as if on the far left, on the far right, there are two giant magnets. And those of us who, and I consider myself one, a kind of centrist liberal, we're like the iron filings, floating through the air. Yeah. And the magnets are pulling us like to one extreme or the other, and the center collapses. And you only need to look at how quickly we descend into intolerance, and how particularly leveraged through social media. Yeah. Where we can deal no longer with human beings, but with caricatures of human beings. Yeah. And when we do that, we are capable of extraordinary cruelty. And sorry.
No, I just wanted to, because now, if anybody wants to make a guess on the one statue that has been pulled down twice over many years, I'm going to put it up again. Nobody's had a guess. Doesn't matter if you get it wrong, because you probably will, but have a go anyway. But I wanted to, I'm looking down the list here, Peter, and there's some that are obvious on that theme we've been talking, but why on earth was Christopher Columbus pulled down in Caracas, Venezuela?
Well, I mean, Columbus is an interesting one, because the thing about Columbus is that of course he was discovered, inverted commas, America in 1492, and of course he's associated with all manner of brutality, but you see, the thing is that and he's associated with colonialism and imperialism, and his statue was dragged off. Supporters of Hugo Chavez dragged him off the plinth, and put him on trial. They put the statue on trial.
They put the statue on trial.
They put the statue on trial. They dragged him through the streets, and eventually they found him guilty, and they hung the statue upside down from a tree. If we cannot see,
oh my God,
where this type of behavior leads us, and of course, Columbus Day, which is the 12th of October, was eventually renamed the Day of Indigenous Resistance. Now, but this is where we have to be careful. We have to be careful that we don't, try and heal the wounds of the past by simply reopening new ones in the present. So, and Columbus, but the interesting thing about Columbus thought his journey, he thought he was heading east. His desire was to give riches to the Spanish crown, so they could make like a holy pilgrimage to Jerusalem, so that they could send more souls into paradise. His motivations were profoundly religious and spiritual, and of course, I just want to make a point about those who,
because I've got one more weird one to ask you. So
okay.
Okay, Felix Mendelssohn.
Oh, Mendelssohn.
He's a musician.
Right. Well, this is horrific, right? Now, Mendelssohn's statue was pulled down in 1936 at the behest of the Nazi deputy mayor of Leipzig. It stood outside the Leipzig Gewandhaus, and the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra were on a controversial tour, really, of Nazi Germany. And Sir Thomas Beecham, the conductor, says, "I want to go and lay a wreath at the statue of Mendelssohn, some flowers." And he said, "Yeah, okay." And it was prearranged. Anyway, on the appointed day he arrived there, plinth, no Mendelssohn. He'd been taken down overnight, and his statue melted down or destroyed or ruined by the Nazis. Now Mendelssohn was subject to many attacks by the racist composer Richard Wagner, who wrote an extraordinary. You read it almost with incredulity. An extraordinary essay which he published first anonymously, then put his name to it, called "Judaism in Music." It was an
Yeah.
extraordinary piece. And he denigrates the Jews as lacking culture. He denigrates the Jews as I can't remember the quotes, but as chattering, squeaking, squawking. He says their music lacks class. Anyway, and Mendelssohn was one of his targets, not least of which because at one point when Wagner was an unknown composer and Mendelssohn was the giant of classical music, Mendelssohn sent one of his compositions to Wagner sent one of his compositions to Mendelssohn, who promptly ignored it. Anyway, the statue of Mendelssohn comes down in this wave of anti-Semitism in 1930s Germany. And what's terrifying is an activist librarian at the British Library, where there was a bust of Mendelssohn, decided this is in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in 2020, that the statue of Mendelssohn really should come down. This bust of Mendelssohn at the British Library should come down. Why? On the grounds of Western civilizational supremacy. That's what she said. Now, if you cannot see where that type of ideology takes you, it doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump on the right, whether it's this kind of activist librarians on the left, if you cannot see where this kind of divisive identitarian ideologies take you, you need to open your eyes to history. And this book, my book is History of Love and Hate, because it shows us how difficult it is for us to love. Because it's easy, let me rephrase that, it's easy for us to love those who agree with us. I quote the gospel, although I'm a humanist, I quote the gospel in one of the gospels in the opening chapter, where Jesus said, look, he said, it's easy to love your friends. I'm not interested in that. Try loving your enemies. Try loving those who disagree with you. Try opening your heart to those who would condemn you. And that's the challenge that we face if we want to survive the torrent, the tsunami of illiberalism that is threatening to swamp us.
We have to squeeze it. I mean, we have rushed through this, but Karen, bless her heart, for a round of applause, has taken a guess that Louis XV is the statue that was pulled down. Tell us whether that is right or not, and give us 30 seconds on Louis XV.
Well, Louis XV was pulled down in 1892 by revolutionaries the day after they'd massacred a lot of Swiss guards at a palace in Paris and fed their genitals to the dogs. And the following day, they're then tearing this statue down in the name of the coming Republic of Virtue. And we all know how that ended, because the architect of many of those ideas in the revolution, Maximilien Robespierre himself in 1794 became a victim of the revolution. And many of the revolutionaries were executed in the place, including the king of where this statue stood.
Goodness, so that's but only once. So give us now, reveal to us
the statue
which
is Athena.
pulled down twice.
Athena, the Greek goddess Athena. And shall I tell you a few words about Athena?
Yes, please.
Fascinating story. The statue was 2.5 meters high, and she was torn down first in 385.
385 AD. AD, right? Okay, long time ago.
So 385 and by Christians. So Christians on their crusade against pagans, they swamped into the ancient city of Palmyra and hacked at her robes and gouged her eyes out and sliced off her nose and left her face down in the desert, where she stood for more than 1,500 years. Then in 2016, again, you have ISIS come into the city, and they attacked the same statue again. And
this same statue, it's not a replica, it's the same statue.
She had one arm survived the Christians. They hacked that one off, and they beheaded her. And now, but there's a real, and she, of course, was the goddess of reason, of law, of justice, and she stands against these ferociously illiberal and intemperate and tyrannical ways of behaving. But there's a real tragic footnote to this, because in that same city, there was an archaeologist called Khaled al-Assad, a remarkable man, born and bred in the city of Palmyra. He devoted his entire life to preserving the antiquities of Palmyra. And just to give you an idea, in Palmyra, there was one statue at its peak in the 2nd century. There was one statue for every 100 inhabitants, whereas typically in cities of that time, there was one per 1,000. It was a city of many, many statues, many antiquities. Now, Khaled al-Assad had devoted his entire life to preserving this. And ISIS came in, and while ISIS were coming in from the city from one side, he was loading all sorts of artifacts onto trucks to get them out the other side. And they said, come on, Khaled, you have to come with us. You have to save yourself. No, he said, I was born here. I lived here. They will leave me alone. I'm 82 years old. What do they want with an old man like me? Well, they wanted a lot. because they wanted either to know where the statues were, to destroy them, and the antiquities were, to destroy them, or to sell them for foreign currency so they could buy arms or whatever. So eventually they tortured him. ISIS tortured him. When he refused to talk, they let him go. A few weeks later, they arrested him again and they tortured him. And this time they killed him and beheaded him and hung his body from a Roman pillar in the ancient city of Palmyra. And then they transferred it to a traffic light in the center of the city, where they hung it with twine, and they put still with his glasses on, they put his head between his legs, and they put a placard on his chest saying "Director of Idolatry," which of course mirrors many of the placards that people did in Maoist China when they had to display their sins through the streets, the crimes of which they were.
The Confucius, the whole Confucius
thing. So
that is a dreadfully sad story. But where is the Athena statue now?
It's still there, and it's.
Is it on display? Is it?
I'm not sure. I think it is. I think they're trying to restore the city. I think it's. You can go and see it there now, and you can. Yes. And it's been. And I'm not sure whether it was on display, and it was put back on display, but I'm not sure what's happening with it now. But it is there, and it exists, and I'm sure it probably is still on display.
I want to ask you, Patrick asked an earlier question, which I think can sort of round it off, is he says, what policy do you recommend on statues? How should it work? Should there be local referenda to vote on whether they accord with current values?
Well, here's the issue, right? Is that it's very difficult because the situation is so divisive, to the point where in Nuneaton, for instance, when there was an attempt to protest against some colonial era statue, I'm not quite sure the statue they were protesting against, but protesters stood around the statue, they didn't obviously aware of who she was, of the novelist George Eliot, the great 19th century novelist Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the name George Eliot, because they were frightened of her taking down. And the basic policy, if you're going to change statues, you're going to reinterpret, you're going to change the landscape, you do it by consent. And you need to make sure that there's representatives from all sides of the statue debate, if you want. Yeah. And there's attempts to do this. I mean, the Mayor of London put up the Landmark Commission, I believe it was, to look at what we should do with not just with statues, but with renaming streets. And Yale University, interestingly enough, came up with a number of different suggestions, really, for how principles you should rename by. And Jerry Coyne, evolutionary psychologist, although he was in favor very much of evolutionary biologist of keeping statues up, even though he's on the left and disagrees with many of what the statues go by and contextualizing or reinterpreting them, he suggested, I think it was him who suggested, that if a statue was put up to glorify racism, for example, rather than a statue of being somebody who did an enormous amount of good, but who also happened to have racist views, he said there is a difference between those. In that sense, you would separate, for example, the Confederate monuments, which were put up not during the antebellum South or immediate aftermath of the Civil War. The primary decade for putting Confederate monuments up was 1910 to 1920, and they were moved out of the cemeteries where they were originally put as memorials to stand in town squares. And indeed, there were lynchings that happened at the base of these memorials. And you've got to remember, in the United States, there were 2 or 3 lynchings per week for 50 years.
Yes.
And so when it comes to statues, I think, one, it's important that distinction, I think, between a statue that was put up to glorify something that was inherently malevolent and a statue put up to celebrate someone who may not hold the views we have today, because of course they don't, because they lived in 1600 or 1700 or 1800 or 1900 or even 2000. And that's why even you get statues of Mahatma Gandhi being attacked because of his views about Black Africans.
Yes, no, and in 30 seconds, tell us about Our Lady of Caversham.
Lady of Caversham was taken down in the church at Caversham was taken down by Henry VIII's enforcer, John London, who raced in there and gave it to Cromwell, who promptly took it out of the church as part of the destruction of the monasteries and his desire to marry Anne Boleyn and his revolt against Rome, and eventually it was burnt in. But it's an interesting one, actually. The same year, have I got time to give one quick more?
You've got 30 more seconds left, and
okay.
Then
well, here's a good one. There's in 1538, the same year, the statue of Delvar Gadan was taken from a Welsh village and carted down to London and given to Cromwell to be burnt in Smithfield. But the statue was burnt on the same day as a recalcitrant friar called John Forrest. and they were both burnt together. The statue and the man were burnt together. And there was an old prophecy about the statue of Del Valgaran, which says, when the statue is destroyed, it will burn a forest. And the statue was burnt alongside the body of John Forrest. So
I just want to give you
the killing of people.
Surrey makes the point about statues being used to promote nationalism and mentions that India recently erected a giant statue of Sardar Vallabhdas Patel in India at huge cost.
Well, we haven't got time, but in the book, and I recommend this chapter in particular, I talk about the destruction of the statue of B.R. Ambedkar.
Okay.
And that's a fascinating story, which goes into really about the caste system and how we divide ourselves into those who are higher up the caste system, those who are lower, what's good, what's evil, and it's a
brilliant. Okay, I just want to do. Emma. I want to put up there before we go to our promotions, but I want you to stick around, Peter. Emma says, "I like this. I look forward to reading your later edition of your book." There we go. That'll be the paperback out April the 5th. The message of tolerance comes clearly to me. I might add on, to know who we are and where we are going, we need to know our past. Don't destroy statues, preserve them in a special place for the sake of history.
Yeah, and there's two comments to that, and quick ones. You can take two quotes. One from Confucius. He says, don't sit down until your mat is straight. In other words, look at yourself first. The Christian equivalent of that is, let him who's without sin cast the first stone. And we should bear those in mind before we start tearing the ground on which we stand.
Right. Okay. Stay there. Tomorrow we have coming up our book of the month, Goldster's book of the month, which is a debut novel, The Appeal by Janice Hallett. There is a mystery to solve in a small town of Lockwood, and it starts with the arrival of two secretive newcomers and ends with a tragic death. And much of the action takes place around a local amateur dramatic society. March 31st, that's next week, I'm Inside Story with KJ Howe. That's Kimberly Howe, who writes thrillers with a tough and complex female lead character. She is also the chief executive of Thriller Fest. Now, that's an annual conference that brings together big writing stars like Lee Child, Frederick Forsyth, Peter James, George Martin, who created Game of Thrones. So come into that world with KJ Howe with me on March 31st. And April the 1st, Lucinda is with one of our own Goldster people, Age Well tutor Susan Saunders. She is the author of the Age Well Plan, a 6-week program to kickstart a longer and healthier, happier life. So, Peter, just coming back from that, as we get older, do our minds of love and hate change? Is a 70 or 80-year-old going to rip down a statue?
I think testosterone might have a lot to do with that. I think that it's classic, really. I mean, men in particular will want to conquer the world when they're young and preserve it when they're old for future generations. So, of course, as people get older, they're far less likely to tear statues down. And that's why you see, for instance, even among, I talked about the robber barons, people like Andrew Carnegie and so on and so forth, they will plunder the world in their youth, and then they'll try and make reparations in middle and old age. And also we acquire wisdom, we realize that these great utopian ideals we may have, the ideals of conquest, the ideals of immortality, as we get older, we're looking at a different landscape. Most of our life is behind us,
And where are you now? Because you seem to be very passionate about your loving and hating of statues. Are you mellowing or getting the speed under your feet?
Well, I mean, in a way, my interest is not so much statues as love and hate. What matters to me is that we learn to live together. We have to find a way to get away from the hateful rhetoric that happens on the left, the hateful rhetoric that happens on the right. We have to find a way to find a common humanity. Otherwise, there isn't going to be any society or any culture with which we can share, because we simply will no longer exist as a community in any viable sense of the word.
Okay, that's great. Emma wants to know which is your best social media platform, what is your Twitter handle? Give it to us again.
Dr. Peter _H at Dr. Peter _ as DRPETER and _H.
It's in the chat, Emma, but there we go. We are out of time. Our special Goldster expert in statues, history and psychology, and who comes because of our new partnership with Aspects of History. So look up to that, sign up to it. Look up Peter on his drpeterhughes.com. So that gives you all, Emma, it gives you all the Twitter handles and everything like that. And tell him, write to him about about love and hate, and whether you love or hate what he's been saying, he'd love all that. And Surrey says, do you have a website? Yes, Surrey, drpeterhughes.com.
The website is just the cover of the book, and it's a bit of a video in there. The best link is probably the Twitter link.
Twitter him and tell him that you love and you hate him. So until tomorrow with Lucinda and a murder mystery, and there'll be a statue in that village at the end of it. Thank you all for joining in, and thank you all of you behind the scenes, Goldster colleagues, your questions, your comments. Karen, for your guests, we'll give you an applause for that. And thank you, Peter, for a really fun and illuminating hour.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you all.
Stay involved, stay curious, and stay safe. Bye.